you for attending today's webinar, Patent Strategy in Challenging Times. My name is Daniel Skolnick. I'm a partner at Goodwin, patent attorney. And before we start, just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This presentation is being recorded. This is a general presentation about rapidly changing issues. It should not be construed as legal advice because we are not considering the facts of your specific situation. If you have a particular situation on which you need advice, please reach out to your Goodwin contact or any one of us, and we can make sure to connect you with the Goodwin team addressing these issues. All attendees will be muted, and if you'd like to ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will answer in questions as they come in, so please feel free to ask away. All right, so we are pleased to welcome our guests, Alan Crane and Charlene Stern. Kathy McCarty, another partner, will introduce herself and Charlene in a second. I have worked with Alan for many years at this point. Alan is a partner at Polaris Partners and has been there since 2002. His most recent venture is founding Seismic Therapeutic. Prior to that, Alan co-founded Dino Therapeutics along with Harvard professor George Church and scientist Eric Kelsick. And prior to that, Alan founded Pandion Therapeutics to focus on tissue-specific immunomodulation for autoimmune disorders. And from 4 years from the Polaris seed funding, Pandion became a clinical stage company, a public company, and was acquired by Merck for $1.85 billion. Prior to that, Alan was also involved in founding Momenta Pharmaceuticals, Vistera, and many others. So thank you, Alan, for coming. We look forward to hearing your views on the world today. Kathy?
Hi, thanks, Dan. My name is Kathy McCarty. I'm also a partner here at Goodwin in our life sciences team and a patent attorney similar to Dan. I am going to introduce Charlene Stern. Charlene started out at Goodwin. She started her career as a patent agent, then a patent attorney, where she then left to enter into some very successful early stage companies and lead them through an evolution. Most recently, Charlene has been head of the chief legal officer as well as head of business development at Editas. So I'm going to kick it off today. We have some questions for our colleagues here, and really want to start out to hear from each of Charlene and Alan. How do you view the landscape in biotechnology today in view of what all's going on in the world? We'll go ladies first. Charlene. Oh, I'm sorry. Alan, you were going to kick this one off. Sorry.
Is that right? I'm flexible.
Yeah, you get to go first. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think on the bright side, we really do have unprecedented advances in technology. We have an understanding of biology and an ability to make drugs like we haven't had before. We also have new modalities, and AI is really emerging as an important force to transform how we discover drugs. There's also more need from pharma for the innovation of biotechnology than ever. But we are in a negative cycle. But I think it's always important to remember when we're in these cycles, and I've been through quite a few of them, that you have to look at the long-term fundamentals, and the long-term fundamentals of our business are actually very good. This is quite a severe downturn. As Dan alluded to, I've been doing this for about 25 years, starting and building companies, and this is certainly a very prolonged cycle. And it's really been particularly difficult for early stage companies and early stage companies with novel approaches to raise money. There's been a flight to things that are less risky, so things that are maybe more follow-on in nature and closer to or in the clinic. This has all been fueled, again, not by the fundamentals of biotechnology, but by macroeconomic factors and political uncertainty. So it's very important in these times when a lot of young companies are not even getting funded at all, and we are seeing really unprecedented levels of really some excellent companies going out of business because they're not able to raise money. It's important to have real fiscal discipline. And so we do have to think about how we're spending resources on IP. But IP is actually really critical to building value in a company. It's critical uh, to creating our competitive advantage. It's critical for investors and it's critical for partners. So, we have to be very thoughtful. And in general, my recommendation to my young companies is that we continue to really invest very strongly in intellectual property.
Thank you, Alan. Charlene, over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Dan, for having me join. So I agree with everything that Alan said. I think the parts that I would add are, the last 3 to 4 years have been really tough, and many companies are finding themselves in cash conservation mode with no easy path to think about how they're going to raise their next round. And that is true even if they're anticipating near-term clinical milestones and Catalyst. So as a result, I'm seeing that many companies, are in fact narrowing their pipelines. They're reducing headcount to focus on those fewer number of products. But with that said, our mission still remains the same, and our mission is to find medicines for patients in need and to continue down that path to finding, medicines, new medicines, and to serve the patient population. We need to do so with a lot of discipline, a lot of rigor, and with the fewer resources that we have. I may be optimistic here. I do feel like there is some small window that's starting to open. We're seeing some increase in M&A. We had what seems to be a positive FDA roundtable last week in the cell and gene therapy space. And, we seem to be maybe making some small steps to sort of hopefully see a light at the end of the tunnel in what's been a very tough few years. Unfortunately, I think that we're in this for a little bit longer. And that really comes down to, for teams to succeed, management teams need to be leaders. They need to show a level of discipline and laser focus on execution such that we're able to, get strong clinical data or strong data that will help, achieve maybe more modest, but still raises and partnerships to continue forward.
So Kathy and I work with a lot of startup companies, early stage biotechs, and we often get questions of I want to protect everything and block everyone from doing everything. So the sort of the platform IP question, as both of you know, obtaining really broad claims is always a challenge. But nonetheless, how do each of you in your experiences and sort of going forward view platform IP filings and how important are they? Do they provide value? Do you need them for fundraising? So how do you view them both, practically and from a business perspective? And I guess since Alan spoke first on the last one, we'll start with Charlene on this one.
Sounds good. So I view platform IP as if you can get it, that's great. It's nice to have. I think that in the early days of any company, particularly if you're a platform-based company, having that IP or the potential to get that IP is part of your story. It's part of talking to partners. It's part of talking to investors. It allows you to talk through, how you're going to have a competitive edge and be a leader based on that platform. It's nice to have. It's not always possible to get. And I think that you have to recognize that from the early outset of trying to secure the IP, you may not get these claims. And therefore, how are you thinking about your overall IP filing strategy such that you're well positioned to maintain the competitive edge, even if you don't get the claims? And so I think that, over time, platform IP becomes less of your story, particularly if you're looking to develop products. So I don't view it as absolutely crucial, but it is something that's nice to have.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I guess I would add that I think it is context dependent in terms of how much you emphasize platform IP. It's context dependent to the company and the nature of the technology. I think it's very important to lead with what are the IP strategy needs, not what are the financing needs. So if your platform IP, if there's a good chance that it's going to allow you to um, get earlier, broader filings that are ultimately narrowed and will cover some of your products, and basically provide some protection and some an earlier priority date, in addition to then the species that you then apply for that are more specific to the product. Then I think it can be a very good strategy. It also does create uncertainty for competitors when you have early IP that they have to think about navigating. Um, but I think it has to be an authentic part of your IP strategy. If you're simply doing it to finance or to partner, I think that investors and partners will see right through it, and it'll be viewed as a waste of money. So sometimes it's really impossible to have any kind of robustness with respect to a platform filing at all. You can't even imagine how it would be narrowed and help you. I don't think it's worth doing then. But I think if there's something genuine about the approach that you're taking, I think it can be very valuable.
I think just before we move, I would agree with that comment. As I always tell clients, um, every like talking about IP strategy, it's important to know what the purpose is and sort of understand sort of the long range strategy, as Charlene said. Like it has to be a cohesive and comprehensive story. So I think we're all aligned there that it's a good to have, not necessarily necessary in the long term, but everyone should know like sort of what the strategy looks like so you understand what the spend is going to be, and that's important.
A follow-up, which is not on our previewed list, but if you think if your view is that it's going to be challenging to get, are companies starting to reconsider whether to file at all and whether maybe your competitive advantage would be better maintained through keeping that information confidential or through other means? Or do you still believe that companies would prefer that platform intellectual property even at the cost of the publication of the technology? Start with
I
Charlene.
Yeah, I think this is a tough call. And I think that what you really need to think through is why. So let me start here. Why you would file the patent if you were going to disclose, or file the patent application if you're going to disclose. Why are you putting yourself in a situation to disclose key parts of your platform early on? Because you may or may not get the the patent claim ultimately down the road. So I think that if you think it's going to be really difficult to secure claims, I think that you need to put yourself in a position of what do you need to disclose and when, and what are the advantages for an early disclosure? It may be a scientific conference. It may be you're trying to create buzz for your company. And I think that's what puts companies in the position where they might not think they can get the platform IP, but then they find themselves backed into well, we're going to file the application anyway. And now we're going to disclose all of this information about our platform, which if you could have had a little bit more discipline or thoughtfulness about what you actually needed to disclose, you might have been able to keep it secret longer and then decide ultimately this is not something we need to file on. We're not going to spend the time or money doing it. But I think that's what creates that tension of whether or not you're going to file on the platform.
Yeah, and I think it all goes back to being authentic in your IP strategy and not and doing it for IP reasons, and then the logic will follow with respect to buzz and financing and all that.
Mhm.
I think with respect to your question, Catherine, about on the margin today, obviously companies that are out of money are having to make very difficult decisions, maybe even more difficult than not filing even good platform IP. Um, the good news is, as expensive as IP is, it's actually a lot less expensive than research, uh, and it's very valuable. And so we just have to keep in mind what its value is, and we have to put it in balance. But not every company has the luxury of being able to maintain all the intellectual property that it would like to.
Yeah, but before we move on, someone in the Q&A asked, what do we mean by platform IP filings? And since the audience is quite diverse, just sort of what the company's technology is founded on. So these examples, since Charlene is here in the gene editing space, like there's all the CRISPR patents, which are not to get into all that disputes, but that were being fought over on like who invented it first, sort of the broad claims that would prevent other people from using your technology to do whatever they want to do. Sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
Okay. All right. So next question, we'll start with you, Alan. A lot of the technology that startup companies will acquire or will use early on come out of universities or institutions. And how do you think about managing and valuing those relationships with your academic founders, especially if the IP might have lesser value or different value maybe than envisioned by the institution or the founder?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the institution and the founder separately. I think with the institutions, I think, I really focus on building long-term relationships with these institutions. I think it's really important. And they're all premised on we want to create a win-win scenario. And we kind of we have to be able to talk very clearly and plainly with each other about, what each other's needs are, but what the situation is. And I think it's very important to have very candid discussions about how the intellectual property from the institution fits into the overall framework and what's going to be involved in advancing the company. And you can't always have a meeting of the minds, but I think when it's a good discussion and the right person is on the other side of the table, I think it's often very possible to really level set on what all that means. There are lots of things you can do to manage discrepancies in the perception around value of the intellectual property. How you structure the deals, non-exclusive deals, for example. Um, I always like to focus, for me, when I'm doing a deal with an institution, on I'd like to get the royalties and sub-licensing as low as possible, and I like to trade off other things. And so sometimes it's in the actual terms that you just come to your appreciation. I often focus, even in this difficult environment, on increasing the nearer term fees, sometimes above what they ask for, because those near term fees are usually quite small in comparisons to other expenses that we have as young companies. And I also like to give institutions a little bit more equity, sometimes even more than they ask for, not with a lot of anti-dilution rights, but it gets us both on the same side of the table. With respect to founders, I think you need to look at not only the value of the IP that's coming from the founder's lab, but very importantly, because companies change over time, and there may be very little to value to the initial IP that came from the founder. Um, but what's their role going to be, longer term as you progress the company? And in general, I believe in treating founders in a more generous way, really developing a sense of goodwill and being in this together. And it really creates a deeper sense of involvement, and really being a part of the team. And it's a general philosophy of us at Polaris that we like to build very strong long-term relationships with the best academic founders in the world, and just treat them appropriately, treat them well. Um, because the better you treat people, the better they treat you in return.
Thank you, Alan. That was very, very helpful. Charlene, over to you.
I completely agree that it is all about the relationships. You're going to be interacting with your founders and with the institutions from who you license in technology for a long time, and you may see them in multiple capacities over the course of, a few companies. And so developing those relationships, having those candid conversations, understanding where there might be a value perception is all, critical to having, what I would say is going to be a very long discussion about the importance of the IP that you're, bringing in from the institution. I think that founders play such a unique role, particularly in any early stage company. You cannot underscore the potential that they have and the value they bring for talent development coming into the company. so many interesting, exciting conversations that take place that really get the early scientists, some of whom may be, from the founder's lab, really sparking ideas and sparking where can we head? What are the limits for where we're going to go? And I also think that there's just so much that the founders in particular bring with respect to they're out there, they're talking about the science. They have a different platform than the early stage companies, and it really complements, I think, the development that you're looking to have within the four walls of the company. So I think that both are critical and, key relationships to have. Of course, those relationships evolve over time. Founders do tend to, step away at least in a formal capacity, but they're never really gone from sort of the fiber, particularly in the early years of the company.
Dan, your
And
microphone is muted.
Sorry. There's construction going on in the background in our building, so I'm trying to not let that leak through. Um, so we got a question. We're going to go out of order, and it's sort of an interesting question, so that's why I'm sort of taking it out of order. So someone asked about, and this is a little bit different. It's a sort of a mix of regulatory and patent strategy. As Alan, as you mentioned, AI is starting to play an even bigger role in drug development. And there are obviously the regulation of how AI is being used or communicated to the regulatory agencies in drug development is evolving. Um, but do you see a real difference between sort of the regulatory requirements to disclose how you're using AI? And do you actually have to disclose that you've used AI in the development of the drug if the drug is itself not like the drug is not or the service is not AI related? I actually don't know the answer to that, but I know, Alan, you may based on the company experiences you're having presently.
yeah, I mean, I haven't been involved in the details of the regulatory filings.
Yeah,
I mean, one of my companies has used, I have a couple of companies that are deeply using AI to develop drugs. And one of the companies has a couple of programs that are in the clinic now. Um, the drugs themselves are not AI. The drugs
yeah,
are, standard, modalities. But, I think in general, in regulatory filings, we do disclose, the process for, discovering the drugs. But I don't know of any,
yeah,
specific additional requirement beyond that. I mean, there are, you know, there are services and products that, directly involve AI as what's actually being delivered, and
yeah.
that's probably a different.
That's a different regulatory issue. I mean, I think to answer that about patenting the sort of the machine learning AI methods that companies are using to develop drugs, that is very fact specific, and will depend on sort of how companies are disclosing what they're using and the timing of that. So, um, rather than answer that question in a broad stroke, that is a good question to talk to someone about, rather than sort of give a definitive answer here. Um, so our next question is, I guess, what do you, we, both you and Charlotte, Alan and Charlene have talked about sort of the value of IP as in the company, and I guess when you're talking to partners, either pharma or trying to raise money from investors, how do you see the investors and those partners prioritizing intellectual property? And does it change as the company evolves from platform to a product company? So I guess the early investors care about one thing and then it shifts to as you get closer into the clinic or you're in the clinic, and so you have later stage investors. I guess from a practical standpoint, how do you see how do third parties that are looking at your company look at the IP? I guess is the basic question. And I forget who's first. I guess Alan, you're first on this one.
Yeah, I would say, in the early stage, it's critical to have a well thought out strategy, both for freedom to operate and how you're going to create a competitive advantage through intellectual property. I think it's less about the specific filings at the very early stage, but I think investors are often looking to understand the thought process. How is this going to evolve? Because the IP will be at in an immature phase in the early going. But how are you thinking about playing in the space that you're in, given the landscape that you're entering into? I think as companies advance and begin to focus more on specific products, then the devil really is in the details. You really need to make sure that you have FTO, that you're going to have the ability to practice, and you have the ability to create some exclusivity, whether that'll be broad class exclusivity or just specific to your product. It'll depend on what the situation is, in terms of what kind of breadth you have to show for different investors. It's interesting with pharma. Pharma tends to be more focused on just protecting the specific product and tends to think less about, sort of broader exclusivity in a new class or something like that. Sometimes they're interested in that, but generally the way they practice their business, they expect to have competition, just not for their specific product.
So let me
Sure.
answer the question from a slightly later stage company perspective. So IP is going to be an important part of any partnering discussion or fundraising discussion. Where it usually comes up, though, is after the following two things have been established. First is that you can show clear value creation for the assets that you're trying to partner or raise money as the clear value drivers for the company. And the second is, after you've established that the management team or the team can execute and you have shown the path to the next clear clinical or regulatory milestones. If you pass those two things, IP is the next topic that is going to be discussed. And in those cases, what partners and investors really want to understand is that you do have the exclusivity. It may be, as Alan said, just really focused on the drug, that you have a way to um, protect the sale of that drug. The second part of the conversation, and where I find that the conversation, usually has the most interest, assuming that the teams have done their job around filing the patent applications and prosecuting them well, is around FTO. And, most estates portfolios are not always as clean as you would like them, and there's going to be something to talk about. In which case, how well have you thought about your risk mitigation strategies? How are you scenario planning on whether or not, there will be challenges from third parties? How are you thinking about, licensing? Is there actually an opportunity to license? If there is an opportunity to license, how does that impact the stack that you may already have? And when are you going to approach companies? So all for potential license. So all of those things really become central to that discussion. If you pass the overall asset, you can show the value creation, you can show that the team is executing well and can achieve the milestones on a timeline that makes sense, then it's really going to be about how well can you manage and navigate the IP landscape that may exist for that product.
Thank you, Charlene. Continuing on some of the more specific IP questions, as you know, intellectual property does start to become expensive once we have to capture the worldwide patents in the major jurisdictions and beyond. How do you think about coverage for your products and your platform patents, not just in the United States, but more broadly geographically? And how do you manage that when, as finances become, tighter?
Mhm. So I can start on this one. So, I always focus on where are we developing, manufacturing, and where are we going to commercialize? And you have to look at it the lens, even if you don't think you are going to partner, there's a good chance you might need to partner, particularly in tough financing environments, in which case then you need to be thinking about what would a partner expect to see for this potential asset or, a part of the platform that we're looking to license. So in those cases, that's where I start. Where you actually need to protect or want to protect and market. Everything else after that really becomes a nice to have. And you might add something here to be a little bit opportunistic, but those are the places that when you actually have to make tough decisions and you actually have to look at your IP budget and you actually have to look at where you're spending dollars and on what cases, the first thing that I'm going to be looking at are the lower hanging fruit cases that are really not adding value. They're not core to the platform or they're not core to the overall asset that we're developing. That those are the places where I'm going to start cutting families of cases first, and then I'm going to look at what's really, really important to what we're doing, and then start looking at the geographies that just don't really move the needle for the company, and then I would start pruning in from there.
Alan?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add beyond that, other than to say that, just this point that it's still important to file in the critical jurisdictions. And IP is expensive, but it's not as expensive as other things that we do. So it's still important to do. And I thought Charlene's answer covered everything. So
Great.
I think Alan is a great advertisement for people not complaining about our bills.
I didn't say that. You should scrutinize
I
your
think so
your
too.
your patent attorney bills.
um, but speaking of expenses, so when companies start, there's always this question of, do I need to do a freedom to operate search? Do I need to do sort of a landscape, see what my competitors are doing? A question we got in the chat was, especially with these new modalities, which are becoming more and more like Frankenstein molecules, where you start combining different parts. So each part could have potential infringement issues or FTO issues that you have to consider. Um, so, I mean, I think I know Alan's answer on this, but so what is your view on the timing and sort of how important it is to spend money and when to spend the money on the FTO and clearance and landscape, especially early on?
Yeah, and we've done a lot of this together. So I think that we typically don't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars early on FTO. But I think it is important even early on to understand the landscape. So we do make some investment in trying to understand the landscape, but often it's very difficult. Whether it's a Frankenstein molecule or even a more typical molecule, and you're just at an earlier stage and you don't know exactly what your product's going to look like, the breadth of what you have to search and what you have to look at is complex. So I think we try to get a perspective on what it's going to look like and how we have to think about our research strategies as a result. Maybe we can understand what are some key pieces of intellectual property that are out there that we need to make sure that we have to avoid. And then we tend to do more FTO once we have a product. And then it's much more focused what we're doing because we know exactly what we need to search, and so it makes the FTO less expensive than it would be to, be searching something that is really quite diffuse. But I think it's important to, in a, in a smart way, identify what the key risk factors are, but you can't be absolutely comprehensive early on.
So once again, I think Alan's remarks tee up perfectly for me to take it from a slightly later stage, from company perspective. And I would say early and often, you need to understand the IP landscape. And I always view it as the earlier I know about a potential issue, if someone on the team is raising it, the earlier we can think about risk mitigation plans. We can think about whether or not we want to approach the company for a license. We can think about whether or not there's a potential partnership that could just naturally be there. We need to assess how strong of a threat the other IP may be or not to the product development that we have. And we can start to scenario plan all of those potential outcomes. I think, you get to a certain point in time in your company growth, particularly if you're a public company, that you are going to be looking to raise money. And whether that's an underwritten financing or whether that's using an ATM, you're going to be in front of counsel, talking through what are the IP updates. And you don't want to be caught by surprise in those situations. And you want to be able to have, to the comments that were made earlier from Alan, like a genuine story. You need to understand the IP story that you're sharing with investors. It's such an important part of the story. But I think the other place that it's, really, once you get to a certain point in development, where you really just need to understand the landscape and how it's evolving is around partnerships. Particularly in these times where partnerships are going to be crucial for, maybe how you fund the company or how you think about your programs. You don't want to be caught by surprise. And I think, no one likes to be caught by surprise, particularly management teams and boards, and they don't want to hear that IP is all of a sudden an issue for a product that they've been developing all along and think has considerable promise with respect to patient outcomes and as a value driver. So I like to do searches early. I like to keep my finger on the pulse and know that my team has their finger on the pulse of how the landscape is developing. And I think that that's crucial as you're thinking about, getting into later stage development.
Great. Now we're going to go kind of to the blocking and tackling when you think about managing your intellectual property. As your company grows and you evolve, how do you sort of weigh the balance between making the investment to hire someone in-house versus, continuing to lean on your outside IP counsel? And does that change depending on sort of how the market outlook is? Alan, do you want to go first?
Well, I think it's Charlene's turn to go first if she
Okay.
wants to.
I was gonna say, do you want to
Sure.
take earlier stage companies and then I would take later stage companies? We could do
Yeah,
it that
well,
way, Alan. That might
yeah.
make sense.
Okay, you want me to do the early
Yeah.
first? I'm happy to do that. We typically in earlier stage companies do not have in-house IP counsel. And then as the companies grow and we have a portfolio that's growing of intellectual property, then we tend to hire IP counsel. I mean, the advantage to having someone in-house is that they can partner more on a day-to-day basis with the scientific team and then interface with outside counsel. And none of my companies ever go it alone strategy without outside counsel. We always work with outside counsel whether we have people in-house or not.
Yeah, so I'll take the handoff and say, there becomes a certain point in time, particularly as you're getting development candidates, that having in-house counsel is just key. What your IP council can then do at that time is really become an extension of the R&D team, a thought partner of the R&D team. They're thinking about, what parts of the product need to be covered, may or may not have been covered well in an earlier application, or how to evolve the portfolio. The other thing that they're doing is they're playing a very critical role with the business development team, and I really think that they're also an extension of that team in evaluating technology that you may be looking to bring in, as well as, are there any potential opportunities to partner or to license out. The next thing that I find that by time you're at that phase of growth, and then definitely as you're starting to move through clinical development and really thinking hardcore about your manufacturing strategy, is your IP counsel that's in-house is really thinking about how you're protecting the know-how, what know-how is going at risk to potentially go out the door that you want to make sure is not going out the door in different disclosures, and how the overall sort of portfolio is coming together for the long term. So I think by time you're sitting at that, starting to get a lot of your development candidates in place, having in-house counsel is absolutely um, critical and important. And then they're just playing a very broad role on so many fronts with respect to how the company is moving forward to develop the technology. All, of course, in conjunction with our good friends as outside counsel.
Thank you.
Another
Uh,
plug.
yeah, no, I mean, that's the trend. I mean, I will say I've recently seen a trend with some very young companies hiring IP counsel very early. So it's interesting to hear um, your thoughts on sort of how that is evolving. Um, Before we get to sort of the questions that sort of one-off questions, maybe. I guess, both of you have been doing this a long time. I guess, what are the lessons you have learned that drive your IP philosophy, whether good or bad lessons? I have learned over the years that people's sort of touch points or things that they are concerned about are usually driven by something that has happened to them in the past related to IP. So just curious to hear sort of what lessons you've learned. So I guess Charlene, you're first.
Sure. So I think drug development is a marathon, and there are a lot of things that need to go right to advance from a development candidate through phase one, phase through two to get to a late stage clinical development stage. And during that time, you have, I guess what I would say is I'd back up and I say, your IP counsel, they've been looking at this product for a long time. They've been looking at it from the very, very early days. They've been thinking about how to file and protect the asset or the platform. And they've also been thinking about all of the risks in the landscape that exists there. I think the one thing that I've really learned is you have time. You have time to develop portfolio strategies. You have time to think about risk mitigation. The issue that may be keeping you up at night based on something that you've identified in an FTO search may or may not come to fruition if the company can't raise money, and that ultimately becomes one of the um, portfolios that cease development on or you put aside. And I think the recognition that even good drugs don't always make it across the finish line gives you the perspective to know that you are playing the long game and that you have time to scenario plan. You have time to think about where to be opportunistic, where to be aggressive, and where to just sit back and give it time to see how things are going to evolve because landscapes do change and drug development paths do change.
Alan.
I think my corollary to you have time is you should start early.
Yeah.
Um, Often the first expenses that I have for a young company that I am building are for work with IP counsel. I think that it's really important from the very beginning to really develop that IP strategy because it's going to be so critical to how you build the company. And I think really, again, having a strategy around freedom to operate and how you're going to create a competitive advantage, that's something that needs to start very early, the thinking about that. I think it's important that it's a joint endeavor and a joint engagement by your research team and your business leadership. It's really a combined effort. And I think it's absolutely critical to engage the right outside experts who have the appropriate expertise in the nature of the IP that you're, looking to establish.
Um, I think we can do one of the questions that's in the chat. This sort of goes back to the foreign question. And maybe, I don't know, both, or we'll start with Charlene if Alan has anything to add. So someone asked, what do you mean by critical jurisdictions? I guess it obviously depends on the patent. And every country is incrementally more expensive, but may not be incrementally provide more value. So I guess how do you view, is there a way you sort of triage those foreign jurisdictions based on economic market for whatever the product is?
Yes. So, usually you're looking at the US and Europe first, depending on where your focus is. Those are the first two places we consider. And then you're looking at where if it's a product and you are developing it for a certain patient population, where are those patient populations? What areas of the world are you expecting to actually commercialize? And so those become the jurisdictions that you think of next. I think that there's a general a tendency to like just look at major markets and say, okay, well, I'm gonna file in all of these developed countries because they have, a good healthcare system. Well, that may make sense, particularly if you are have a certain platform, but you really need to understand where the patients are and where you actually expect to treat patients and where you also expect to manufacture. I think that's another area that you always have to think about where are we going to make this drug and where can our competitors make this drug? Because those are places that we're going to want to file.
And I think the other question, Alan, you actually might be able to answer a little bit. So someone asked, do you have advice for platform companies that are more about a service or partnering and collaborating than maybe, but are discovering and developing novel molecules, but they're doing it for other companies? And so I guess, how do you view IP for those companies based on their platform? And I don't know if the answer is going to be that different, but I know you have some personal experience in this area as well. So
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's one thing if you're providing it as a service. And so what might be regarded as kind of safe harbor in a product development sense, if you're developing a product and you might partner the developed product, is different than if you're providing a service where what we regard as kind of platform that we don't need to file on, you might need to because you actually may be commercializing either, a method or even compositions. Like if you're in the business of making available antibody libraries or something like that, the question is that what you're actually commercializing and selling? So I think the strategies are somewhat different, and you have to, seek the advice of a good patent attorney, and make sure that, you're really protecting what you need to, because the strategy can vary from a company that's doing drug development.
all right, thank you. Kathy, you want
Great. That ends the questions that we had prepared for this group here, and we seem to have no other questions from the audience. So I guess we just got one more question for you, Charlene, hot off the press. Um, would your strategy, Charlene, for the various critical jurisdictions vary depending on the modality of the product, whether that be, for example, a biologic versus a small molecule?
I always think it's context dependent. So, depending on the drug you're developing, yeah, you might think about it differently.
Okay.
Yeah, and by the way, even the markets for different modalities are different in terms of what
Mhm.
jurisdictions, like you were
Interesting.
pointing out earlier, Charlene, are reasonable markets.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, I think we should end this on a high note. Your insights were extremely valuable. Um, I've got one more. You guys up for one more before I wrap it up? Okay. Um,
that
this
may be a little that may be a
out.
little too specific.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that one.
Yeah, yeah. Really
Whoever asked the
about a
questions, if you want to reach out to Kathy or me, we can talk about that offline.
yeah.
That's a little too specific. Apologize.
All right, but all right. Thanks, Alan and Charlene, for your time today. I know you guys are both very busy and your insights. It's great to hear from people in the trenches who are building companies and really delivering these exciting medicines to patients. And we're grateful to just be part of it. So thanks for your insights today and for your time. We really appreciate it. And I hope that this was informative to those of you who also took the time to join us. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
So long.
Bye.
Bye.